Before we start, I would like to announce that we have live streaming over the internet on 2 channels, in Turkish and in English, as we have also other countries interested in our debates today. We have sent these messages via our partners and via our offices to the countries in the region and Europe. We do have Twitter and Facebook here, so what we discuss is known to a wider public, wider than only the ones who are here in this room. Dear former Minister of Justice of Germany, dear guests from abroad, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation. My name is Michael Meyer. I'm the director of the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation here in Turkey. Before I say a few words about Constitution, let me just introduce very briefly the Ebert Foundation. We are active in more than 100 countries around the world. In Turkey, we established an office 25 years ago, and we are active on basically 3 main program areas. One is democracy promotion, rule of law, and human rights. The second is social issues, and the third is foreign policy. Dear participants, today we have invited representatives of the civil society from 10 countries of this region to discuss their experiences in the process of constitution making. After the Arab Revolution, this process of rewriting the constitution has started in many of the neighboring countries. The level of participation of civil society is very different, as is the specific situation of each country. Are there basic common elements of these new constitutions? Are human, religious, and minority rights enshrined in these drafts? And how are they going to be protected? What are the ideas concerning the structure of the state and government? Centralized or decentralized? Presidential or parliamentarian form of democracy? How is the participation of the people in the process guaranteed? For us, this is a possibility today of experience sharing amongst representatives of the civil society, which should ideally strengthen the network in the region. Ladies and gentlemen, Turkey is currently undergoing a similar process of drafting a new constitution in a transparent and democratic manner by the people, institutions, civil society, and mainly the political parties represented in the Constitutional Commission and in the Parliament. We believe the new constitution of Turkey should be issued with the highest reconciliation possible, by including all layers of the society and all political actors in the process. We also hope that the Commission has the famous quote in mind which says, "The Constitution does not grant rights, it recognizes them." The people of Turkey expect a lot, and it's up to the politicians to live up to these expectations. Dear participants, last October, the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation organized a first conference on the experiences in constitution-making processes in 4 countries, namely Germany, Poland, South Africa, and Spain. We have prepared a book which you can find outside. We are supporting 2 constitutional websites. One of them was officially launched by the Speaker of the Parliament. We supported conferences and meetings of minority groups to help formulate their expectations towards the constitution, and we conducted seminars in various regions of Turkey. By supporting all these projects, we hope to raise the awareness that the new constitution is meant to defend the dignity and interests of each and every human being. It's the foundation for Turkey's democratization process. This needs, I know that, patience and the long-term commitment to engage in many small steps. I wish you, therefore, success in today's discussions. Thank you very much for your attention.
That is indeed great production. Hello, everyone. Welcome all to this meeting. I'll fast forward and make up for the time that is traditionally lost in the Alaturka or Ala regional way, so that the meeting can proceed on time. I'm Emel Kurma. I'm with the Helsinki Citizens Assembly for a long time, and the organization has been around in Turkey and across the Balkans and Caucasus and partly in Europe, based on the whole idea that it's citizens that matter and count for as a guarantee of our togetherness, of building the togetherness of societies, of multiplicities, of diversity. So that's how, in our mind, we understood the constitutional process. It's a reflection of how we constitute the rules of the game of our togetherness. This is relevant not only within our respective countries, but also across the borders. So I'm very pleased and I'm really grateful for this opportunity that the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung and us, we collaborated on this and have come up to this meeting where we have an opportunity on several grounds. First is to have our distinguished guests, speakers, experts who have a knowledge, an insight, a perspective of their own countries and in the region at large, so that we can look into our processes of constitution building or the struggle to build constitutions towards democratization as a component of the democratization across our region. We can look at the bigger picture while looking in our different experiences. It's a pity that I do not speak any Arabic or Farsi, and this has been an ache in my heart. It's somehow the ties of Turkey to the region has been cut off for some time, and one main binding vein or link was the language. Very few people in Turkey, I believe, speak Arabic. I'm just hoping to see the day where we will have elective courses in the schools, like on Arabic, on Farsi, on Kurdish, Armenian, Greek, so that the region is integrated not only economically, not only socially, but also on a cultural, political ground. And with that remark, at the beginning of the meeting, rather than at the very end, I thank our interpreters, who I will get their applause at the very end, but now I thank them for having us, making us possible to speak to each other through English. Many thanks, and I wish all of us a good start and a fruitful meeting. Thank you very much.
Everyone here okay? Good morning. Welcome to the first panel of the conference. We're going to talk about Iran, Syria, the Kurdistan regional government, and Turkey today. And we're going to have 4 speakers, one of whom is, we're assuming, on his way, Mr. Çandar. We have 4 speakers, each distinguished in their respective fields. And I'm going to start by introducing Abbas Vali, who's going to be our first speaker. Professor Vali obtained a BA in political science from the National University of Iran in 1973, after which he moved to the UK to do his graduate studies in modern political and social theory. He obtained a master's degree in politics from the University of Kiel in 1976. He then received his PhD in sociology from the University of London in 1983. This was followed by a postdoctoral research fellowship funded by the Economic and Social Research Council in 1984. And then Abbas Vali began his academic career in 1986 in the Department of Political Theory and Government at the University of Wales, Swansea. He was invited by the Kurdistan regional government to establish a university in Erbil in 2005. And then he was the vice chancellor of the Kurdistan University of Kurdistan, before he was removed for disagreements with the KRG over the management of the university in May of 2008. Professor Vali is now teaching, has since then been teaching modern social and political theory in the Department of Sociology at the Bosphorus University in Istanbul. What is yours?
Thank you very much. I think I should start with my discussion with a note of thanks to the Helsinki Citizens Association and also the Friedrich-Ebert Research Institution. Talking of Friedrich Ebert, I just remembered that his name is extremely relevant with what we are discussing now. He was part of a great constitutional assembly after the First World War in Germany, along with many luminaries such as Max Weber, Otto Kritzheimer, and Carl Schmitt, and Franz Neumann, and others. And they did some of the greatest works ever on theoretically and legally on the writing and character of a democratic constitution. What has left from this is a staff of teaching in graduate studies. And it is only befitting that this may be in a very small way a continuation of what they did in 1918 and 1919 in Germany. I will start my discussion by focusing on the Constitution, both as a Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran, both as a formal legal document and also as the object of very important political struggles, political power struggles in Iran in the aftermath of the revolution. The document of, it is only befitting to locate this formal legal document in its appropriate political and sociological context, because the document carries the mark of those situations. This is a document which very much signifies the predominance of Shi'i religious forces in Iran. And to that extent, it is an evidence of the political power struggle which went on in Iran after the revolution. The document of the Constitution of Islamic Republic is one of the most strange legal documents, political legal documents anywhere in the world. Its constitution, its structure, and its discursive structure, so to speak, are very evidently paradoxical. And this paradox also shows the nature of political power struggle involved in making this document, and also the character of forces which were involved in this. I am emphasizing this because this will have extremely important relevance to what is going on in Turkey now. But I believe that it would be simplistic to try to focus on the document without looking at the context, political context, and power struggle which is going on behind the scene to write and formulate this document. The paradoxical nature of the document of the Constitution of Islamic Republic arises from the fact that this is the only constitution that I know of, to my knowledge, in the world, which contains two diametrically opposed conceptions of sovereignty. Every constitution has a conception, one conception of sovereignty. This conception signifies the state power, which is thereby codified in the Constitution, and this codification is presented as law to the citizens, which defines both the identity of the state as well as its relationship to the citizens. In the Constitution of the Islamic Republic, we have a very strange situation in which we have two conceptions of sovereignty. If you read the document of the Constitution, in the Article 1 of the Constitution says that power emanates from the united will of the Islamic nation of Iran. That is what it says in the Article 1 of the document, whereby it is a kind of representation of the doctrine, democratic doctrine of popular sovereignty, whereby power is said to derive from the united will of the people or the nation. But if we go further to Articles 5, 55, 56, 57, we see quite a different story. There it says that power is only attribute of the divine. It is the attribute of God, and it is delegated to us by God to manage our affairs. Here we have a conception of power and sovereignty which is fundamentally different from the one which is stated in the Article 1. These two different perceptions of power, different conceptions of power, different representation of the nature of power, and it is subsequent codification, and it is subsequent institutional arrangement in the Constitution shows the nature of the conflict in Iran after the revolution. On the one hand, you have the secular forces who have participated in a popular democratic revolution against a monarchist dictatorship, who are expecting to have a constitution whereby democratic principles of popular sovereignty will define the nature and boundaries of power. On the other hand, you have the religious forces who have not only not have any respect for the idea of popular sovereignty, in fact, they are fundamentally opposed to it, and they find it anti-Islamic. I refer you here to the writings of prominent Islamists, not only in Iran. If you look at in Iran, the context of Iran, writings of Ayatollah Khomeini in the context of wider context, Egypt, if you look at the writings of Sayyid Qutb, if you look in India, to writings of Maulana Maududi, the first political position that they take is against what they will call the Western, alien, and non-Islamic conception of popular sovereignty and democratic rule. Therefore, it is not strange that the power struggle in Iran was conducted in terms of the opposition between these two conceptions. And this opposition, of course, was in the wider context conducted in this battle was conducted in a situation where the power of the ruling religious forces was increasing immensely. And if we look at the date that the Constitution of Iran was put into referendum, which was the end of December of 1979, we look at that date and look at the context of Iranian politics in a huge turmoil, in a situation which has been created by the religious forces, and this is basically resulting from the takeover of the American embassy on the 4th of the November 1979. The takeover of the American embassy is a very astute tactical move that the religious forces have done, and the religious forces have done that, particularly Khomeini himself, Ayatollah Khomeini himself being behind this, and this is to disarm the radical political forces which are on the left and the center of the political field, and they are opposed to any idea of a religious constitution in Iran. As a consequence of the takeover of the American embassy, we see that the left, both the radical left and the conventional left, is split subsequently. Is split on the nature and on the idea of who is the real anti-imperialist in Iran. The takeover of the American embassy had left very little doubt in the mind of the majority of the left in Iran that who was the real anti-imperialist. And this made it very easy for the religious forces to divide the secular opposition and take their, if you like, ideas forward insofar as the Constitution was concerned. The first draft of the Constitution, it did not contain the doctrine of the government of or guardianship of the theologian, which is authored by the late Ayatollah Khomeini. The first draft did not contain that because it was still the Constitutional Assembly, and the battles which were being fought in media, in the public sphere, were very much against that. But the revised form of that draft, which subsequently became the text of Iranian constitution, did contain that. And it shows that in the period of from the beginning of the first week of November to the end of December, the political scene in Iran had fundamentally changed in favor of the religious forces. And the religious forces had succeeded to incorporate the doctrine of Vilayat-e-Faqih into the constitution as the fundamental base and the focus of political power. In relation to that, the doctrine of popular sovereignty, which still exists in aspects of the constitution, became terribly marginal. The constitution remained paradoxical, and this paradox persists today. And ever since the late December, end of the December of 1979, the Iranian constitution has been through changes. But these changes also have been carried forth and have been accomplished by the dominant religious forces. The first changes came soon after the ratification of the constitution, which was the change of the political system. The prime ministership was removed when American presidential system was incorporated. The second change which came was more important, and that came in after 10 years in 1989, after 10 years after the ratification of the Constitution, and this time the doctrine of the government of the theologian, which is based on the principle of this divine sovereignty and sovereignty of God, was revised and consolidated. The doctrine was changed from the doctrine of the rule and government of theologian to the absolute rule of the government, the absolute rule of Wilaye Mutlaqe Faqih, the absolute ruler, which means that whatever even was there of the democratic principle in the constitution were simply, they became ceremonial things, ceremonial. Despite the fact, one might say that yes, Iran continued holding periodical elections, Iran continued having parliament, it did continue holding periodical election, and it does still hold periodical election. We had only 1, 2, 3 months ago. That is not the point. But the point is here that this doctrine of Wilayat Faqih, which is a Shi'i doctrine, which says that in the absence of the 12th Shi'i Imam, which has gone on occultation, and in the absence of his rule, which is the only righteous rule to which Muslims should submit, in the absence of his rule and in his own absence, it is only the grand clergy which, if you like, legitimately acceptable rulers in the country. In other words, it is a doctrine which, on the basis of the Shi'i principle of imamah, justifies the rule, the absolute rule of the Shi'i theologian in the country. But to say that, yes, there were periodic rules and there are periodic elections, yes, but this institution of Wilayat Faqih has subsequently in Iran also created its own institutions, such as the Guardian Council, such as the Council of Experts, such as the Expediency Council. These are incorporated into the Constitution, and their rule is always supreme and prior and prevails over all other institutions which are related to the formal structure of the government. For instance, the Council of Guardian has been given the right, the Guardian Council, to vet and choose from those who come up as who become candidates for the parliament. And if this council rejects a candidacy of a candidate, that candidate has been disqualified and cannot stay. So we can see that, yes, there are periodic elections, but these periodic elections must go through the filter of Wilayat Faqih and its institutions. And what is, however, just few words, I have very little time to say that the idea of constitution and it is notion of the absolute rule, which has been incorporated into the Constitution, has always been a subject of dispute and struggle in Iran ever since 1979. And never this issue had come up more forcefully forcefully than recently, that is 3 years ago, nearly 3 years ago, after what may be called the coup d'etat of July 19, 2009, whereby the result of the elections annulled and the winners of the elections were, if you like, disqualified from taking presidency. It was a presidential election. And there were, by popular consent, there was a huge degree of ballot rigging and all other forms of disqualification of the legitimate candidate. After this, we have the start of the Green Movement, which is a democratic movement for change in Iran. And in the context of the discourse of the Green Movement, we have the quest for the change of constitution. There are three fundamental ideas as to what has to be done with the constitution of the Islamic Republic if there is a political change in Iran. One is that the constitution of Islamic Republic is okay, but it has been practiced strongly. And this is clearly the position of the political Islamist reformists inside the movement, and they are very strong. They do not budge from the idea that the Islamic character of this constitution and by same token, the Islamic character of the government must change. There is, however, another trend among the religious opposition in Iran, which says that the constitution has to be revised and it has to be amended, whereby the religious section of it, which is based on Khomeini's, Ayatollah Khomeini's doctrine of Vilayat-e-Faqih, should be taken out, and that the democratic principle of popular sovereignty should become the only basis of the definition of power and representation of power in Iran. There is, of course, then another position here, and that position is this, that this constitution has been part of the oppressive regime that has been established in Iran after 1979. It has been instrumental in the creation of this oppression, and this constitution must go. And in the context of what is going on in Iran, after particularly the advent of the democratic movement on June, July of 2009, what I would say is that those positions which are trying to revise the constitution by keeping the constitution and retaining its religious character seem to be not part of the solution, but a part of the problem. And I think the paradox of existing in the constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran has been sorted out by the movement of the political forces. That constitution is defunct more than ever, particularly after the coup d'etat of June, July of 2009. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Vali. I think as we go along, we're going to see clear analogies between these four entities, as well as parallels and contrasts, which will be good to keep in mind for our discussion later, which will be, for which we'll have about an hour. So do keep note of those. Next up, we have Professor Christian Sinclair from University of Arizona. He's the Deputy Director of the university's Center for Middle Eastern Studies, and he's the Director of their program in Jordan. He's also a member of the Executive Committee of the US-based Kurdish Studies Association. Professor Sinclair teaches democratization and human rights in the Middle East at the University of Arizona and ethnography of the Middle East in Jordan. He's given more than a dozen talks in the past couple of years in the US and Europe, mainly on the human rights situation of the Kurds, with particular focus on the media, language, and politics. And his most recent article, which was published in Merib, was The Evolution of Kurdish Politics in Syria. He has lived in Syria for 7 years in the 90s and has returned regularly since then. Professor Sinclair, you have about 20 minutes. 20 minutes.
First, I want to thank the conference organizers for inviting me. I think you've probably noticed that I will be the only one who's actually not from the country that I'm speaking about, whereas everyone else is from that region. So I feel particularly honored that I would be invited all the way from Arizona to speak here in Istanbul. And as Nigâr said, I spent 7 years living in Syria, returned quite frequently, most recently last March, leaving the day that everything started in Daraa. And today, I was trying to figure out the best way in which to kind of explain what the current situation is. And I think that I've come up with an analysis that will do justice to that by examining the past constitutions of Syria and really examining how those have changed over time based on regional events, so that we can see why there's so many roadblocks today with the opposition groups. So with that, I'll start. Abraham Lincoln, 16th President of the United States, argued in his first inaugural address in March of 1861, just over 150 years ago, that there can be no exercise of the right to revolution when no substantial constitutional rights are threatened. His exact words were, "If by the mere force of numbers a majority should deprive a minority of any clearly written constitutional right, it might, in a moral point of view, justify revolution. Certainly would, if such right were a vital one." I think protesters across the Middle East today, based on Mr. Lincoln's words, have been justified in their revolutions. Surely many constitutional rights, many vital ones, over many decades have been denied to minority and other groups. The justification for these revolutions, that is, one group depriving another group of its rights, must not be repeated. It is essential that any new constitution, regardless of the makeup of the country, ensure the rights of its citizens through constitutional checks and limitations. But I'm not here this morning to talk about generalities and constitutional issues. I will refer to them, but really I was invited here specifically to speak about Syria. So Syria, now some 13 months into a bloody uprising, is a country of rich diversity, cultures, languages, and various ethnicities. However, the dominant ideology of the country, one enshrined in the constitution, is that of Arab nationalism. This leaves little or no room for expressions of non-Arab identity. Add that mix to the totalitarian nature of the country's repressive regime, and you're left with a gaping human rights hole, a hole that can only be filled with a new constitution and a total restructuring of the state. The constitution in place in Syria at the moment, promulgated in 1973 and revised last year, is completely meaningless given the autocratic nature of the regime, a regime whose own ideology promotes its own interests rather than that of the people's. In the crafting of a new constitution, one might ask, what is the role of international law? International human rights law establishes a set of universal requirements for the legal and administrative order of every state. International human rights law is built on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR. The insistence on popular sovereignty or democracy is one of the most salient features of the UDHR. Article 21.3 reads in part, "The will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of the government." That notion of the will of the people somehow got lost along the way in Syria's history, to a point where, as I just mentioned, it is now the needs of the state shall be the basis of the authority of the government. This then begs the question for the moment, who will form the people upon which the authority of a future Syrian government will rest? Right now, perhaps the people in question have manifested themselves in the form of the Syrian National Council, or the SNC. The SNC has been named the legitimate representative of the Syrian people. But does the SNC truly represent the people? With accusations of foreign influence and declarations from the SNC leadership that a certain minority group will not be given group rights, Syria might be on the way to a new constitution, but will it be an enlightened document offering true democratic citizenship, or simply more of the same? Of course, the minority group that I refer to is Syria's Kurdish minority. The Kurds in Syria make up approximately 10% of that country's population, and it's the largest ethnic minority there. They have long been denied the most basic expressions of identity in a ruthless push to promote Arab nationalism and save the territorial integrity of the state. I think you'll see some parallels with other regional entities here. So most of my talk this morning will be focused on the evolution of Syria's constitutions and a look at the at Kurdish rights and how they've been excluded from participation in democracy in Syria. I think then at that point we can ask, what does this long repressed group need to feel like equal partners in a new Syria? And also, what mistakes of history have led us to the current situation whereby this group has been so brutally repressed? Citizenship might be one of these demands. So let's look at that for a minute. If we examine the modern concept of citizenship, this would imply a quest for integration at the national level without distinction based on race, color, religion, gender, etc. A new Syrian constitution must ensure the process of integration moving towards democratization. It requires a willingness to integrate rather than exclude in whole or in part, and requires integration without assimilation. Integration without assimilation, that's absolutely key. So let's jump back from modern concepts of citizenship to an earlier time. Back in Greek and Roman times, notions of citizenship existed but then disappeared during the medieval period. Citizens initially were members of the networks within emerging cities, where citizen is derived from the word city. And those in the city, in other words, those living within the city walls, had the power. Those city walls today are represented by an ethnic and ideological divide, leaving Syria's Kurds outside of those metaphorical city walls. A new constitution, a new state structure, must expand those walls in order to incorporate all of Syria's people, not just the Kurds, but everyone. Syria is a multinational state that for decades has been ruled by one national group, the Arabs. So the only path really to equality for a Kurd in Syria, the only way of obtaining any form of respect or dignity, was to accept the assimilationist policies of the regime. At that point, you were then allowed into the city walls, so to speak. Those who refused became second-class citizens, denied their right to express their identity and speak their language. Others became stateless altogether, simply existing as unrecognized inhabitants. Since Syria's separation from the Ottoman Empire, the country has witnessed many constitutions and constitutional changes. In the early years immediately after the dissolution of the empire, Syria was, ever so briefly, not even for a year, the Arab kingdom of Syria under Faisal. Syria then became a mandate under French administration, and it took 8 years of haggling between the French administration, between the French mandate authorities and Syrian nationalists to come up with a constitution that was even remotely agreeable to both parties. But at no point during the mandate, despite these 8 years of negotiation, was any constitution consistently in full force. The very first constitution, that of 1920, called the Syrian government an Arab government. So we see from the beginning, 90 plus years ago, there was a move to make Syria an Arab nation. But as I said, that was a very short-lived experiment, and the French jumped in, establishing a mandate. The French High Commissioner at that time, Monsieur Ponceau, worked with the Syrians to prepare a constitution and the formation of a constituent assembly to draft that constitution. That was in the late 20s. And around that time, a Kurdish delegation petitioned the French mandate authorities in Syria for political, cultural, and linguistic rights, including the use of Kurdish as a medium for teaching in the Kurdish regions of the country. You can see, even from the very beginnings, these same demands were being asked. However, examining the leanings towards the Kurds of the newly formed government in Ankara under Ataturk and the predominantly Kurdish British-administrated Vilayet of Mosul, the French declined to offer any concessions to Syria's Kurds. The reason was that the fear that it might encourage nationalist aspirations. So eventually a constitution was drafted, although the French felt that it overstepped the bounds of the mandate and was in contradiction with France's mandatory powers. So they decided to take the constitution back to France, eliminate some of the lines, and add an article, Article 116, ensuring French control of the country. Jumping ahead a few years, in 1946, Syria eventually did gain independence, and their new constitution was simply the removal of that Article 116. In 1948, another regional development affected the long-term evolution of Syria's many constitutions, that being the creation of the State of Israel. For the first time in Syria's constitution of 1950, we see the addition of an article stating that Syria is a part of the Arab nation. This can be seen as a direct response to the formation of the State of Israel. In an excellent article from the Middle East Journal back in 1951, Majid Khadouri discusses the question of Syrian unity as another additional factor that influenced Syria's constitutional evolution. The French, if you remember your history, carved up bits and pieces of what was Greater Syria, offering parcels of land to neighboring countries and even establishing Lebanon as an independent entity. This might be Syria's version of the Sèvres syndrome. Khadouri continues in his article, probably far more disrupting to the present Syrian state, this was 1951, than the question of unity is the lack of cohesion among the various political forces. Stability in government presupposes the development of constitutional traditions. Frequent changes of regime hardly afforded an opportunity of developing the tradition of responsibility necessary for stable government. So what was developing at that time? We have a fear of territorial disintegration, rising ethnic nationalism, worries about political stability, and regional geopolitical shifts outside of the government's control. Again, probably sounds familiar with other regional entities facing some of these same issues. In 1953, another constitution was declared in which we now see in Article 3 that the Syrian Republic, and at this point there was no Arab, it was just the Syrian Republic, that the Syrian Republic should pursue the goal of a united Arab nation. That constitution didn't last very long, though, and a year later, the 1950 constitution was reinstated. But that was the beginnings of this idea of united Arab nation. At the same time, during the 50s, a large-scale Kurdish political movement emerged to counter what was happening with the Arab nationalist movement. The demands at that time, so now we're jumping ahead from the 20s, when the Kurdish delegation went to the Constituent Assembly in Damascus, to the 50s, what they wanted were, one, constitutional recognition of the existence of the Kurdish people in Syria and recognition of the Kurdish movement as their legal representative. Two, Kurdish participation in the administration of the state's affairs at the legislative, executive, and judicial levels. Three, establishing the Kurdish language as one of the official languages in Kurdish areas, an allotment of airtime for the transmission of Kurdish programs on Syrian radio and television, freedom of press for the Kurds, recognition of Nowruz as a national Kurdish holiday, and the establishment of administrative autonomy in Kurdish areas of Syria. This was seen, naturally, through the developing lens of fear of territorial disintegration, rising Arab nationalism, etc., and the Kurds were then slowly moving up the list as the young nation's biggest threat. From 1958 to 1961, Syria was united with Egypt to form the United Arab Republic, the UAR. And it was during this time that Arab nationalism really exploded. The union was an impetus to implement assimilation policies to safeguard the union. Just one example of what happened. Egyptian school teachers were sent to Syria, to the Kurdish regions of Syria, to replace the Kurdish teachers to oversee the Arabic-only language policies in the area. But the union only lasted 3 years, immediately upon which Syria changed its name now to the Syrian Arab Republic, and the Ba'ath Revolution followed in 1963. Recently, in an interview with the leader of the Syrian National Council, Burhan Ghalioun, published earlier this month in Rudaw, the Kurdish newspaper, Ghalioun said, "The Kurdish history in the pre-Ba'ath era was different from that of the Ba'ath era. Kurds are not different from other citizens in Syria. The feeling emerged under the Ba'ath because the Ba'ath Party really pursued a discriminatory, racist, and marginalizing policy against the Kurds. Ghalioun says that the Kurds were part of the political and social landscape and there were no problems prior to 1963. Perhaps this is a Syrian version of the Brotherhood myth. When the Ba'ath Party came to power in 1963, it simply continued the policy of denying Kurdish identity under the guise of promoting Arab nationalism. The temporary constitution of 1964 stated the following. Article 1, Syria is part of the Arab homeland, and the people of the Syrian Arab regime are a part of the Arab nation. They work and struggle to achieve the Arab nation's comprehensive unity. Article 22 stated that citizens exercise their rights and enjoy their freedoms in accordance with the law under the condition of not endangering the national security, the Arab unity, the Republic's institutions, and/or the goals of the popular socialist revolution. In 1969, a temporary constitution was announced, which included the article stating that the educational system aims at upbringing an Arab nationalist socialist generation. During that time, Kurdish identity was repressed through restricting the use of the Kurdish language in public, in schools and the workplace, banning Kurdish language publications, and prohibiting Kurdish celebrations. However, other non-Arab minorities, including the Armenians and Assyrians in particular, were allowed to have private schools, clubs, cultural associations, and their respective languages taught at these schools. In 1967, school geography texts dropped all mention of a Kurdish minority in Syria, and government registry officials began pressuring Kurds not to give children Kurdish first names. Well, the current Syrian constitution, promulgated in 1973 with few revisions since, theoretically guarantees certain rights and freedoms, including some protections of speech. It assigns the regulation of these various rights to subsequent supplementary laws. These laws disregard the principles of the Syrian constitution and of international human rights conventions. Excuse me. These supplementary laws are used to prosecute Kurdish activists, politicians, and students. They are charged with attempting to sever a part of the Syrian territory to annex it to a foreign state, Article 267, involvement in cells seeking to weaken nationalists' consciousness and to stir up racial sectarian strife, Article 285, involvement in an unauthorized organization, Article 288, and aggression aiming to incite civil war and sectarian fighting, Article 298, just to name a few of the examples. So with little time remaining, I'm sure, let me just recap some of the demands of the Kurdish minority today. Mother tongue education in Kurdish, political and press freedoms, decriminalization of Kurdish identity, constitutional recognition of Kurdish identity, through constitutional recognition of Kurdish identity, and citizenship for all Kurds. So you can see over the years there's been very little change in what the Kurds are asking for, but the structure of the state, the constitution, and other supplementary laws leave absolutely no room for the expression of Kurdish identity. And Syria has been especially hostile to any Kurdish political or cultural expression. With the current state structures, even with a new constitution, that will not change. With the fall of the Assad regime, will have to come the total dismantling of the country's infrastructures if we really want to see any changes. Arabs, Kurds, and other groups need to work together to reconceptualize the Syrian state into a multi-ethnic democracy modeled on this idea of integration without assimilation. So I'll close here and look forward to discussing this further during the question and answer period. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll just straight ahead skip to the next speaker. We have a seasoned journalist from Kurdistan in Iraq, Rebwar Kerim Vali. He started to work as a journalist in 1995 and he's currently the editor-in-chief of the Rudaw newspaper, which is being published in Iraqi Kurdistan and in Europe. He's also the chief editor of the newly formed Rudaw TV. Rebwar Kerim Vali worked as a journalist during the civil war that erupted due to the dispute between the Kurdistan Democratic Party and the Kurdistan Patriotic Union. Before he was imprisoned in 2002 because of his articles, he continued to work as a domestic journalist. In 2003, he started to work as a correspondent and representative for foreign press agencies such as the BBC Turkish, RFI Farsi, Independent Europe Radio. In 2004, he established the Piyamner News Agency, which is the first independent news agency in Kurdistan. He is also the founder of Zagros TV, where he functioned as the chief editor for 1.5 years. Wali is the founder of the following newspapers: Haber Post, Baveda, Rudaw. Haber Post was also the first newspaper to be published online in Turkish. His mother tongue being Kurdish, he is also fluent in Persian, Arabic, and Turkish, and he speaks English, and I think he's gonna present today in Turkish. Right? You're gonna present, yeah. Yeah, for which we're gonna need speakerphones here. İki tane.
Good day to you all. I'm Kurdish. I come from Iraq, from Kurdistan, but I will speak in Turkish. As Cengiz Çandar says, since I'm Kurdish, I have created some confusion, I guess. I wrote my presentation in Kurdish, I think, and I write in Kurdish, and I did not write it in Turkish, but I will look at my Kurdish text, and then I will stick to what you have in English as well. There's an English translation of my presentation. What I want to say, basically, is that the issue of the constitution is a multifaceted question for the Iraqi Kurds. In Turkey, there's a discussion of the Turkish constitution, and this will be a process that Turkey experiences within its geographical borders. But for the Iraqi Kurds, this is a multifaceted question. The first point is the Iraqi constitution. The second is their own constitution. And third, the constitutions of the countries in the region, Iraq, Syria, and Iran, and because there are Kurds living in those countries too. So the rights that the Iraqi Kurds have now cannot be compared with that of other Kurds living in the region. And we can say that the Iraqi Kurds have greater rights in Iraq, but they still don't feel like they have the necessary guarantees. And the process that they're going through in Iraq is not sufficient. And they always look to Turkey to see what kind of a constitution will be made in Turkey and how or what kind of rights the 20 million or so Kurds living in Turkey will gain as a result of the constitution in Turkey. I will start with the constitution in Iraq. The constitution of Iraq, which was approved in a nationwide referendum in 2005, is a permanent constitution, and this was approved, as I said, in 2005, and it recognizes the rights of Kurds and other ethnic groups, and in its preamble, it talks about the right to secede, and it talks and defines what that means, and it says that sticking to this constitution allows for territorial integrity and mutual coexistence. And so if this constitution is violated one day, everyone has a right to look to their own future. More recently, there's been a discussion about the independence of Kurds in Iraq, and all this discussion emanates from this article, because Kurds think that this is their natural and legitimate right based on the constitution. There have been 7 constitutions in Iraq. The first one was made in 1925, where the British were very much involved. Before that, there were some tribal rules and various alliances between different regions, and Iraq was governed in this way. And later on, there was an effort to come up with a modern constitution. Turkey, Iran has gone through these processes in the process towards transitioning towards democracy. And when all these regional developments were taking place, the British were very much involved with what was going on in Iraq, and they were involved in the writing of the constitution. And there have been, after this first permanent constitution, there were 5 constitutions, and they were all called interim constitutions. And the very recent constitution, which is written in 2005, is considered to be the permanent constitution. So in the 80 years, from 1925 to 2005, you have the first and the last constitution as being permanent, and the 5 in between as interim. In the first constitution. This constitution was a Sunni Arab-focused constitution. And so the constitution made them the identity of Iraq, the ones who are powerful. And then 80 years later, where this time the Americans, again, foreigners were involved, there was another constitution that was made, and the identity of Iraq has slowly moved to a Shiite character. This is not perhaps very obvious, but this has been the direction. So you might say that history has repeated itself between 1925 and 2005 with these two constitutions. The Arab Spring, of course, is something that we have been discussing very much in the last year or two. And if we consider that as an uprising of the people against dictatorships, if we understand the Arab Spring as such, then you can say that the Arab Spring started in Iraq in 1991. In other words, 20 years before it happened in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, and in 1991, 80% of Iraq, the Kurds and Shiites in the north and south, rose against the rule of the Abbas party. And the world, unfortunately, watched, didn't do anything, and the Iraqi army crushed this uprising, killed thousands of people, and what is taking place in Syria took place in a similar way in Iraq. But this took on a different and a stronger, fiercer version of revenge against the Kurds. And that year, in April, millions of Kurds had to migrate. There was a major exodus. And the international community at the time did help, and the UN Security Council took decision Resolution 688 to protect the Kurdish people in Iraq and to provide for some safe havens, and this led to the creation of a no-fly zone. But there was, you might say, discrimination there as well, because this did not happen to the Shiites, maybe because they did not engage in mass exodus. Maybe the Western countries were afraid that Iran would occupy the region, and so this was a fear on which they acted. But we have seen the influence of Iran in that region after 2003. So what the West feared in 1991 came to pass in the 2000s. 12 years after the Iraqi Spring, in 2003, the Americans first helped liberation, and then they became, unfortunately, occupiers. What makes Iraq different than other countries in the Middle East is because there have always been armed groups fighting one another. So from the time of the establishment of birth of Iraq, there have always been some armed groups, and they have always fought each other, and they are always organized in groups. So when compared to Syria or other countries, the opposition in Iraq actually has been around for much longer. The Kurds, the Shia in Iraq have always organized themselves and have always fought central governments in Iraq. So much so that in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, these groups even had internal fighting, a civil war amongst themselves. After the uprising in 1991, different religious groups, people coming from different ethnic backgrounds, Kurds, Shiites, secularists, all got together. And in 1992, there was a conference which was held in Kurdistan, and there this coming together of parties was announced. And then in 2002 in London, and in 2003 in Kurdistan, and after Saddam's fall in Syria, this opposition body met again. It's very important to talk about this opposition, because now we talk about the Syrian National Council. This council doesn't have a past, a history. It's not rooted in the past, and therefore it's not very influential. Whereas in Iraq, the opposition has been there for a long time. It has organized itself in the past, and therefore it was more forcefully involved in the processes, and they initiated the process of writing the constitution. From 1992 until 2003, all these groups met and formed alliances to create a democratic Iraq, which has a pluralist democracy. And this was what the groups wanted, and they wanted to also have a federal system in Iraq, and all the groups agreed to this. The current constitution of Iraq has been made based on the ideas of these different groups, in my opinion. In 1925, many of the Kurds boycotted the constitution. In 2003, many of the Sunnis boycotted the constitution. But the international community, the Americans, wanted this constitution to be accepted so that it would be presented as an achievement. So this was the case. And the interim constitutions between 1925 and 2005 have been constitutions which were made by the groups that came to power. So those constitutions were like the party manifestos, and they were presented to the people in that way. The 1958 constitution is an exception. Because that also accepts the Kurds as an important part of Iraq, and Kurdish is accepted as a second official language. And the 1958 Constitution talks about activating of regional administration. It doesn't specifically clearly say what it foresees, but this was at least mentioned in the 1958 Constitution. In 1970, the Kurds made an agreement with Ahmet Hasan Bekir after the fighting, and the region, the Kurdistan region, was considered to be an autonomous zone. It was part of the interim constitution, but in reality, the bodies were powerless. There were elections. There was a legislature and an executive council which were established, and these groups were appointed by Saddam once every 4 years. There was a parliament building in Kurdistan, and that building is dating back from these 70s. I have 5 minutes? 7 then. As I have said, parties that came to power in Iraq made their own laws and bylaws into a constitution, and Saddam is known to say, "What is the constitution? I'm the constitution. I'm writing it." 5 minutes is very little for me. The current constitution of Iraq has perhaps the greatest mention of rights, democracy, and pluralism. So it's much more comprehensive today than it has ever been. But it has mostly been on paper. It has not been practiced. And in these 7 years since its approval, it has been violated. It was not implemented in many occasions. Sunni Arabs, for example, last year wanted to establish a federal region, and the central government did not allow them to do so. The constitution, in its articles, legitimizes the use of underground resources, oil and others, but there are all sorts of difficulties there. The central government doesn't allow for the practice of many of these rights. So we see that the constitution remains just a document on paper for many of these issues. Iraq's history, its sociology has to be taken into consideration, and the constitution has not been written by taking those factors into consideration. This constitution was actually written based on a text which was originally in English. So the constitution, when it was written, was in English first, and then it was translated to Arabic and Kurdish. And in 2005, that constitution became the permanent constitution of Iraq. The Iraqi constitution did not make Iraq into a unified democratic country. The Kurdistan region, you think, is a federal region, but it's actually a confederal region, and it doesn't emanate from the constitution. It's not a right enshrined in the constitution. That region already existed, and the constitution came afterwards and gave legitimacy to the fact. If it was in the hands of the Arabs, they would not perhaps have extended this right. If you look at Article 140 of the Constitution, that article is about territorial issues between two countries. It's not about territory issues within a country, because if this were a truly federal system, it would not have mattered who administered some regions, central or local regional administrations. So federalism only remains in name. There's actually a regional administration which has to liaise with the central government, so this is how it has to be. Why haven't we achieved to have federalism in Iraq? Because Iraq is moving towards division. I don't know how things will play out, but the fear is that this could be bloody, like in Bosnia, like in former Yugoslavia, or the question is whether it will be a soft transition, like between the Czechs and the Slovaks. I, unfortunately, think that this will be bloody because there's the issue of territory. Like in the case of Sudan, the South Sudan, it looked like it was working out fine, but then they are back in the conflict again. So the federal experience in Iraq has been unsuccessful. And there are many reasons for this. Kurds and Arabs never lived within the same roof in a country before, and there are many people of different ethnic origin in Iraq, but the Arabs always want to see themselves as part of the Arab world, and the Kurds continue to resist that because the Kurds want to see themselves as part of the Kurdish world. Kurds don't want to live with the Arabs. I can say this very openly. And if one day there is an opportunity for independence, if the conditions are right for it, then the Kurds will secede from the Arabs. There's not a single day which we can share the 9th of April was the day the Saddam regime fell. And that day has been celebrated for 5-6 years. This was a decision of the parliament, but this was recently removed and because it was then considered to be a day of occupation by the Arabs. So it's no longer celebrated. I know my time is running out. I had a lot other things I wanted to mention. Kurdistan had its own constitution. We went through that process. I'll go very briefly here. Up until 5-6 years ago, we've been discussing with the Arabs what we can do jointly, and we have also been discussing what we want for our own region. Ethnic rights, cultural rights have been achieved, but we have been talking amongst ourselves about what we want to do. We have in 2009 a draft which was passed from our parliament, but this was not put to the referendum because there was an awful lot of opposition. Although it did clear the parliament, it was not put to vote. We want to have a more democratic, free, national document. This is what people want to see happen with this regional constitution. I think we'll have discussions for about an hour and 15 minutes. I think we can discuss things then. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Again, we see all these similarities that we see over, emerging themes, overarching themes that we're gonna get back to during our discussion. And of course, the Kurdish demands and Kurdish political opposition is the main one, which I'm sure Mr. Çandar will talk about. Cengiz Çandar, our next speaker, is a journalist and former war correspondent from Turkey. He began his career as a journalist in 1976 in the newspaper Vatan, after living some years in the Middle East and in Europe because of his opposition to the regime in Turkey following the military intervention here in 1971. He's an expert on the Middle East, especially Lebanon and Palestine and the Balkans, Bosnia specifically. Mr. Çandar worked for the Turkish news agency and for a number of leading Turkish papers, Cumhuriyet, Hürriyet, Referans, Güneş. Currently, he is a columnist at Radikal daily. Cengiz Çandar served as special advisor to the Turkish President Turgut Özal between 91 and 93. And between 1999 and 2000, he conducted research on Turkey in the 21st century as a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and as a senior fellow at the United States Institute of Peace. You have, again, 20 minutes.
Thank you. It seems you found the most outdated CV of mine. I have a simpler and shorter one. The theme of, or the title of our conference is On the Road to New Constitution. So wherever that new constitution would be made in the North Africa and Middle East zone, any new constitution has to address to identity rights. And identity rights bring with itself the linguistic rights, language rights. So here I will use the privilege of talking to you in my native tongue, Turkish. So I switch to my native tongue as my and next constitutional right. Şimdi bu yeni anayasa.
Now, we are talking about the way to a new constitution, joining the discussion on the regional countries like Iran, Iraq, Syria, and the Kurdish region, and Turkey as well. The speakers before me had really put forward a series of striking ideas which we certainly need to discuss. The terminology of the Arab Spring is, in my opinion, a contribution of the American media mostly. So, because this topic is not a seasonal topic, as the name implies. The when we saw the pictures from Tunisia and Libya, and then in Libya, then the American media organs who had baptized this movement as the Arab Spring, they immediately changed the name and said the Arab Winter. So we have to see if we can come up with a better terminology. Because in all these countries, in Syria, in Egypt, everywhere, Arabs themselves were involved. When you go to Tahrir Square nowadays, when you talk to an Egyptian citizen, they signify what they did as a revolution. The same with Syria, the same with Tunisia. They define this period as a revolution. So this is a chain of developments which will take a longer time. So particularly in the picture that we have in Syria, this movement still is not sure which direction it will take, how it will end. So it is a historical process whose continuation on which we have still certain doubts. Some call this process as the Arab Enlightenment, and if it is really an enlightenment, then a meeting titled "On the Way to a New Constitution" becomes more meaningful, in my opinion. A famous Western Islamic personality. Well, actually, he's not Western. He's in the. He is from the descendants of Hassan el-Betma, and he's Tariq Ramadan. He's an Egyptian, actually. He calls it the Arab uprisings. Well, whatever and however you call it. It coincides to the same period when Turkey is also trying to prepare a new constitution. So all of these developments historically overlap with one another. This is what we are confronted with. Last year, after the election, before the elections in 2011, where the votes of the governing government went from 47% to 50-odd%, their main emphasis was on the preparation of a new constitution. And for more than a year, there were these preparations in such an intensive preparatory process, also covering the civilian population. And this was like an exercise of preparing a constitutional text. We were confronted, so to say, with an inflation of constitutional documents. Well, but we still don't know. We are not very sure still whether we will have a new constitution in Turkey or not. But this concept created a new mobilization on the part of the Turkish people, and many groups who did not come together in the past, all of a sudden took an interest in this topic, and they joined their forces. I was in Malatya a few days ago. There was a assembly called the Smaller Parliament there, and they were discussing one part of the new constitution. And this is not only true for Malatya region only, it is true for very different provinces, very different regions in Turkey. So the search for a new constitution, this is a social demand, and it is at the same time a political promise by the governing political party. And this is also a hope for the Kurdish, for the solution of the Kurdish problem, because we need the Turkish constitution, which make the solution to that problem more legitimate. And we need that desperately. And this will coincide with a period of historical developments in the Arab world. So the two processes, the Arab movement and Turkey's search for a new constitution, will be concluded in the region with a variety of new constitutions. And we have an interactive relationship between these new constitutions in the region, so to say. The Arab Revolution or the Arab Enlightenment or the Arab uprising, how you call it, it's not important. It started in Tunisia and reached its peak in Egypt, because Egypt is the most fundamental, most populated and the most biggest Arab countries, and it is the Arab leader in many areas, in the politics, in the military, in all the areas. And this uprising put an end to a regime which continued for the last 30 years. Now, Syria is undergoing developments that will change the future not only of the region but of other international relations too. That is what is happening in Syria right now. So Yemen, Bahrain, Libya left aside, not because I am discriminating them, no, but just for these are not geopolitically significant countries. Neither they were not in the history and they will not be in the future, determining the historical evolution of the world. But Tunisia as the place where the oldest uprising started, and Egypt as the most important Arab country, and Syria, where the development's future is not definite yet. Whatever you have it, this will be a this will have very important impacts on the whole region. And it will change all the balances, not only in the region, but also elsewhere. As we heard from Rudaw, it is also developments in Syria triggered certain developments in Iraq too. So Turkey has interactive relations with all these countries, and this is a very striking reality. And Tunisia ended up with a government coalition with Ennahda being in the center. It is Ennahda. It means Renaissance. It is an Islamic country formed by Rashid el-Nushi, and it takes the system in Turkey as an example, and they have declared this several times. And with its present state, Turkey is an example for Tunisia, a center of attraction. And the same applies for Egypt. Turkey, again, has been an inspiration in the discussions of the formation of a new constitution. And I attended meetings in the new Egypt with the participation of the Muslim Brothers and other groups, and I saw that there was a very vivid discussion on how the new constitution should look like, and how in that constitution the division of powers between the newly elected president and the parliament, and how should the relationship between the military and the civilians should be regulated. And this is a very vivid discussion going on in Egypt right now, under the impression and the inspiration of the happenings in Turkey. and all these developments that have been developed and realized in Turkey under the government of a political party which is said to be of Islamic origin are important, and the same is and in Egypt there is a joining of the Muslim Brothers and other political parties, but none of these parties are representing radical Islam in the type of Tekbir vel Hicre or the groups leading by Ayman el-Zawahiri. They are called as the leaders of jihad. Even the Salafis are considered there. So the structure of the new power and the new government in Egypt are trying to save themselves from the guardianship of the military and would like to assume the whole power of the government in their hands. And they follow the policies of the AK Party in Turkey. And they are inspired by many things that AK Party is doing in Turkey. Now, we have to say that Turkey has ended its relations with the regime in Syria. It was considered, the Annan plan was considered as the last resort, as we all know, but I don't know how much application it will find. I have my doubts about it. In the spirit of the Annan plan, the existing regime in Syria was conceived as a party. Therefore, from the evolutionary point of view, the position of Turkey right now vis-à-vis Syria is based on a total abolishment of the existing regime there. The official position of Turkey is against that regime in Syria right now, so much so that they have done something that was not unheard of in our past history. We have opened up the borders and our territories to the citizens of a non-Turkish country. And the Friends of Turkey group, whereby 80, 90 UN member states came together, first in Tunisia, then in Paris, and then here. So this group considered the Syrian National Council as the legitimate representatives of the Syrian people. And they have given thereby a big legitimacy to the National Council, Syrian National Council, which was established in Istanbul, and they are calling them the Meclisi Istanbul, the Assembly of Istanbul. So in Arabic, it's called Meclis el-Watani el-Suriye, but we do not call it the terminology in Turkey is not parliament, but we call it as a council. But the Syrians in the Arabic language, they call it their parliament. And in one sense, it is true. This was created here, and through the help of Turkey and all the members, the governing groups, yes, they are not living in Turkey, perhaps, but this is their headquarters here. And the Syrian National Council has gained power in the eyes of the international public opinion. And in order to do that, a future plan for Syria had to be developed, so that in the meetings of the group of Friends of Syria, this National Council would be supported. And that's what they did a month ago. In English, it is the National Covenant, and it is like a national agreement document. But that National Covenant, I know very well how it was prepared. And it is, you have the very strong fingerprints and footprints of Turkey on this document. The bureaucrats of Turkey and the opponents, the opposition groups of Syria came together in a district in Istanbul, and they wrote an important portion of this text of this covenant. And this is not a negative thing, but this shows merely how interactive Turkey is involved in the Arab Enlightenment. But all these developments, at the same time, also have the potential of influencing Turkey for change. The Turkish foreign minister is considered as the architect of Turkey's new Middle East policy. It is not only the foreign minister, but he is considered as the architect. So because but we have to consider the role of the prime minister as well, because otherwise that would be a bit dangerous for him. So the foreign minister, Mr. Ahmet Davutoğlu, 2 days ago made a statement in the Turkish parliament on the issue of Syria. And he said that apart from the change in the region, that Turkey was deeply involved in this process, but beyond that, he said that Turkey is managing and will manage, is governing and will govern this change in the region, he said. So what the Arab Spring, Arab Revolution, Arab Enlightenment, before all these discussions had even started, Ahmet Davutoğlu had already started a process, a policy of dialogue and close cooperation with the neighboring countries under the general terminology of peace with all neighbors, zero problem with the neighbors. So now we have problems with all the problems in the region, and they have, we have also a part in that. So all of a sudden, Turkey, together with the Arab Revolution or Arab Spring, Turkey is no longer as the protector of the status quo, but as a supporter of change in the region. The power, what we call the power, it may be a superpower or regional power, they continue their existence through a status quo. But one of the most dramatic results of this Arab enlightening or Arab revolution was the fact that it forced Turkey as well to give up the status quo and be more change concentrated, which was Turkey was actually a country which was fixed on status quo and anti-revisionist. But now, all of a sudden, Turkey's foreign policy is changing. It is changing, and it has to change. And now it has problems with many countries in the region. Okay, I have 2 more minutes, so I will be very quick. Now, coming to the preparation of the new constitution. So this change in the region has to be taken into consideration. And in order to protect our claim that we shall be, as Turkey, the governing party of this change, or being an example or a center of influence for the Arab countries, we have to take very seriously that change issue and the preparation of the new constitution issue. Maybe Turkey is now under a very, very serious, very, very unexpected promise and expectation of the others outside of Turkey. Because as Rudaw has stated, otherwise in Iraq, for instance, there is the process of a disintegration there, and there is the group that we call Kurds. And with the developments in Syria, a very serious conflict may be triggered between the different beliefs and ethnic minorities in the country, in the region, I'm sorry. Well, the Kurdish regional government, it is not a very good implementation of federalism. I agree with what he says, but do you really believe that federalism will be implemented in a place like the region of the Middle East? Because federalism is synonymous in many countries of the region with division. And that is true since the Ottoman Empire. So if Iraq is going to be divided, it won't be divided because of federalism, but no, quite the contrary, because there was no successful and efficient federalism applied there. So whatever whichever country you consider in the whole Middle Eastern and North African region, if Turkey is going to continue its influence and inspiration over these countries, they will also look up to the new constitution of Turkey. So therefore, Turkey has to prepare the new constitution in a way as to answer the expectations from Turkey as the leaders or the governing country of the change in the region. Otherwise, the position of Turkey that it acquired in the last 10 years will completely revert to how it was conceived in the times of the Ottoman Empire, where it was conceived as a military power like the United States or others in history. But Turkey is, with its economy, with its commercial capabilities, and with its diplomacy, gives a very different picture right now. And we also have cultural influences also. So these were all acquired through the powerful stances of Turkey. And therefore, in order to make in order to have a really good functioning new region, we need to have a constitution of our own, which is multicultural and multi-ethnic, apart from its identities like a secular, democratic, and Islamic country. Which will also provide a solution to the Kurdish problem. We have to come up with such a constitution for it to be meaningful. If the position of Kurds in Iraq and in Syria is, with regard to their rights, much more progress than the Kurds in Turkey, then obviously that will not be a positive influence. But the new Turkish constitution as a whole will have to become meaningful, because the active policies of Turkey were also present in the previous constitutions. We had the Constitution of 1921, 1924, 1961, and 1982. Actually, the constitutional process goes back to the year 1876, the Ottoman Empire. And there we have very common traits with Iran and the constitution in Iran. But within this picture, only the Constitution of 1921 could give a reference for the active political participation of the Kurdish people. And at that time, Turkey was not republic yet. And therefore, the new constitution should cover similar provisions like the Constitution of 1921 in order to grant, recognize, and protect the rights of the Kurdish people. So it has to be a decentralized constitution. It has to be prepared with the spirit of decentralization. Therefore, if we give no way, no place for Kurds in our constitution, then in consideration of the probable developments in Syria and Iraq, because of the failure of Turkey to come up with a proper constitution, it will lose its powers of attracting, of being a center of attraction and inspiration, and therefore a regional power in the region. So there is a symbiotic relationship between these factors and the preparation of the new constitution in our country. We shall see altogether what the future will bring us. Thank you.
Bayağı konuşacak bir şey birikti.
Thank you very much. We will have a short break now, 15 minutes. We shall reconvene here 25